you at the time were doing your Ren of Men podcast, and you've changed a little bit now. You're kind of rebranding into the Will Spencer podcast. Is that right?
Correct. It is now the Will Spencer podcast. The Renaissance of Men is defunct. It is an ex-parrot.
So what made you want to bridge that gap that way? What made you want to change?
Yeah, ultimately, what the Renaissance of Men was intended to be when I started it was a documentary series. So I had identified, and there's a long story behind this, but I had identified this kind of worldwide movement, and it truly was, and it is worldwide, this worldwide movement to sort of rebirth masculinity. Like we'd lost sight of it for, say for 80 years or something like that. And there was this ongoing rediscovery of masculinity that began in the 80s. And so I found my way into that world, and I found the world, like most people didn't even realize it existed. Most of the men in it didn't realize how big of a movement it was and how many different pieces it was. So I had traveled through that world, and I wanted to make a documentary series in order to show people that it existed. So I started working on that I started the podcast in 2020. I started working on the documentary in 2021, and I produced a bunch of materials for it, like a 3-minute trailer in early 2021, and then a 20-minute overview in 2022. Lots of numbers, but I was trying to get it funded because I self-funded a lot of it, but I was trying to get it funded. I ultimately couldn't find anybody who was willing to invest in it, and praise God, because almost all of the men that I interviewed went on to have very serious life challenges and revealed themselves to not be the guys I thought they were. Whole other conversation.
Oh, wow.
But but then I folded up the documentary, and then and at that point, the Renaissance of Men as a project kind of began losing a lot of my interest in it, especially with the arrival of Andrew Tate, who basically ate everybody's lunch in the dialogue about masculinity. He was the guy who did all the things other guys just talked about. And so I started recognizing a need to transition away from the Renaissance of Men brand as early as 2023 at some point. I started the process actually in December of 2023. And so a whole rebrand, redesign, logo, that process took a while, and finally, got it finished up this year. So it's actually been a long transition to the name of a podcast that is the least likely one to change. So.
The Will Spencer podcast. Now, were you a Christian whenever you were doing the Ren of Men? Because you relatively recently became a believer, huh?
Yeah, just 4 years ago. Just over 4 years ago.
That's awesome. So the Ren of Men was always a Christian project.
So I had been baptized when the first podcast came out. I had the idea for the Renaissance of Men before. So it was all taking place as I was becoming a Christian, but I didn't really start to understand what it meant to be Christian until probably a year or so later, because this was in 2020. So all of the churches were closed. So I couldn't find a church to attend that wasn't like masking up or just, just was an awkward environment. So it wasn't until 2021, a year later, that I met Michael Foster at a conference for masculinity called the 21 Convention. He and I met there. He pointed me to Apologia. And so I started attending Apologia in late 2021 and really only started learning about the faith in early 2022 with the Apologia membership class. So that was what started that process. So it was along that time that the podcast, if you actually go back and listen to my early episodes, and people have told me this who have listened from the beginning, they say that they can actually hear my progression through the faith episode by episode. And I think that's probably very true.